Hey guys, you scrolling through the chaos of the internet, looking for something different. Well, tonight, you just found it. We're diving headfirst into a tale so ancient it predates your favorite myth, yet so oddly juicy it could definitely be the next streaming drama. Gods fighting over a mango tree? You can't make this stuff up, and lucky for you, you don't have to. This isn't some boring history lecture. It's a front row seat to absurdity, betrayal, and divine-level drama, all told in a way that lulls your brain and wakes your imagination. And trust me, you'll walk away not just entertained, but actually smarter. Weird, right? So here's the deal. If you like late-night brain candy with a dose of truth, smash that like, hit subscribe, and drop your city, place, local time in the comments, so we know who's vibing with us in the time stream tonight. Now dim the lights, cue that background hum, and let's unfold the madness of history together. You trudge through the stone-paved street of a medieval town, dodging chamber pots and a suspiciously large goose. Somewhere nearby, someone is singing off-key about Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, which might strike you as oddly specific. But you're not here for the scenery. You're here because something in your mouth feels like a demon is jackhammering your jawbone. Welcome to the 14th century, and congratulations, you have a toothache. Now, before you panic, let's talk options. And by options, I mean a terrifyingly short list. There's no dental insurance, no toothpaste, definitely no floss, just pain, desperation, and the hope that someone with a steady hand and a strong stomach is available. It's easy to forget now, in a world of minty mouthwash and routine cleanings, but back then, teeth were tiny tyrants. A single infected molar could mean weeks of agony, a swollen face, and even death. Historians still argue whether King Henry I of England died from food poisoning or a dental abscess that got wildly out of hand. Either way, dinner was not the issue. Your fellow townspeople might suggest you see Brother Matthias, who technically tends the monastery's herb garden, but also pulls teeth on the side. Or you could try old Gerwin, the blacksmith, who swears he once cured his own toothache by smacking himself in the face with a hammer. It worked, sort of. Let's take a moment here. Close your eyes. Picture it. The throb in your jaw, the swell in your gum line, the strange metallic taste in your mouth that doesn't feel like lunch. The town smells of wet wool and candle wax, but all you can think about is that tiny piece of bone lodged in your face that refuses to let you sleep. Pain was a universal language in the medieval world, and few things united people quite like bad teeth. There were poems written about it, prayers chanted, curses screamed into the cold night air. In some towns, they believed toothaches were punishment for vanity. Brush your hair too long in front of a mirror? Boom, molar misery. They even believed that the devil could plant tiny imps in your mouth, who danced when the church bell rang. Logical? Not really. Comforting? Weirdly, yes. Now here's a deliciously ironic twist. Medieval diets weren't nearly as sugary as ours. Most people didn't sip soda or snack on caramel popcorn, but their bread was coarse and often laced with bits of ground stone from hand-milled flour. Every bite was like a microscopic sandblast against your enamel. So even without candy bars, cavities came for everyone. And when they did, oh, the rituals began. Some would chew on crushed garlic mixed with honey and soot, muttering incantations to Saint Apollonia. Others swore by soaking their aching tooth in wine and spitting it into a fire to scare the pain away. One woman in Normandy reportedly stuffed her mouth with crushed emeralds. This was either a last-ditch cure or a statement of insane wealth, possibly both. Here's where things get even stranger. Tooth pain had no clear explanation, so naturally, theories exploded. Some said it was caused by tooth worms, tiny, squirming creatures that bored into your teeth like termites in wood. This belief lasted way longer than you'd think. In fact, doctors in some parts of Europe were still blaming tooth worms as late as the 1700s. And no, they never actually found one. That didn't stop anyone. Imagine lying in a darkened room, biting on a rag, while your cousin rubs a frog against your cheek, because someone heard it, pulls the poison out. There's incense in the air, prayers in the hallway, and outside, someone's playing the lute like their life depends on it. This was medicine, this was life, and your throbbing tooth was center stage. Oddly, tooth pain became a sort of divine drama. It was interpreted as a test, a punishment, a sign. Some saints were said to develop holes in their own teeth so they could better empathize with your suffering. Martyrs with abscesses became oddly popular. People would visit relics, bones, garments, even toenails of saints and press them against their swollen faces, hoping for relief. One Italian bishop had a toenail that became famous for banishing oral demons. Again, you can't make this stuff up. Of course, there were more practical remedies, if you can call them that. Some apothecaries sold concoctions made of vinegar, crushed snails, and powdered iron. You'd swish it in your mouth and pray you didn't throw up. Others recommended heating a nail until it glowed red, then holding it close, not touching, just near, to the bad tooth. This frightened the pain spirit away. At best, it gave you a second-degree burn. At worst, it reminded you that time traveling without Novocaine is a very bad idea. Let's not forget the medieval dentists themselves. There were some, not many, and certainly not licensed in any way modern readers would recognize, but they existed. Usually operating out of market stalls, these brave or bold souls would yank teeth for a coin, often drawing crowds like street performers. People would cheer as molars were extracted with rusty pliers, partly because they enjoyed the drama, and partly because they were next. Did it work? Sometimes. A clean pull could end months of pain. But if the tooth broke, well, things got medieval real fast. The dentist might dig with a knife, tap with a chisel, or just shrug and tell you to go home and pray. There were no antibiotics. An infected socket could mean fever, delirium, and a quiet burial within the week. Still, people endured. They had to. Oral pain didn't stop the daily grind. Farming, tanning hides, raising children, running from invading armies. If anything, the constant discomfort became a background hum to everyday life. A reminder that life was short, and sometimes the only solution was to yank the problem out and keep moving. And yet, in all this mess, there's a strange beauty. Humans were trying, genuinely, sincerely, desperately trying to fix what hurt. They didn't understand bacteria, they couldn't see abscesses on X-rays, but they knew pain, they knew it was unbearable, and they would rather face chisels and hammers than let it linger. So next time you grumble about booking a dentist appointment, remember, you're not dodging a guy with iron pliers and a prayer book. You're stepping into a climate-controlled office, where the worst part is probably the soft rock playlist. And if your mouth feels fine tonight, take a breath. Wiggle your tongue around your teeth. Appreciate that sweet, blessed lack of ache. Because in another century, that silence would have been a miracle. So here you are, cradling your sore jaw, and wondering how the world let something as small as a tooth hurt this badly. But in medieval times, this pain wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. It wasn't just a problem with enamel. No, it was a sign, a message, a punishment. Because for the people of the Middle Ages, teeth weren't just bones in your mouth. They were battlegrounds for your soul. Back then, people truly believed teeth could rot because your morals were too. Lying too much, adultery, vanity, that upper left incisor starts to tingle. You mock the priest's hair in confession? Boom, premolar meltdown. Teeth were like divine report cards, and when you failed, the cavity came calling. Imagine trying to explain modern dentistry to someone in the 12th century. We use X-rays to look inside your gums. They'd probably think you were summoning spirits. We fill holes with resin, sounds like sorcery. We use lasers to fix soft tissue. Now you've really gone full warlock. Back then, the line between medicine and magic was thinner than your front teeth after too many stale loaves. You have to understand, medieval Europe was drenched in religion. Everything, from crop failures to nosebleeds, had a divine cause. So when someone clutched their cheek and moaned about the fire in their molars, the assumption wasn't bacteria, it was sin. A lot of times, people didn't just seek out a remedy, they went looking for forgiveness. There are records of people whipping themselves, fasting for days, or making pilgrimages because of toothaches. One man reportedly walked barefoot from Bavaria to Rome, nearly 600 miles, because he believed his aching jaw was God's judgment for stealing a neighbor's chicken. That's commitment, or possibly a concussion. But divine punishment wasn't the only theory in circulation. Some blamed angry spirits. There was a very specific fear about mouth demons, tiny invisible beings who slipped in during the night and nested under your tongue. To keep them out, some people slept with garlic between their lips or hung wolf teeth above the bed. Others whispered psalms backwards, because nothing says oral hygiene like reverse scripture and canine accessories. Of course, there were more tangible terrors too, like the widespread belief that saints could bless, or curse, your dental fate. Saint Apollonia, for example, became the poster child of tooth-related suffering. According to tradition, she had all her teeth violently pulled during martyrdom. In some versions, her jaw was shattered, which, understandably, gave her major street cred in the toothache department. People would light candles in her honor, carry tiny tooth-shaped relics, or even wear her image on necklaces to ward off pain. In one particularly intense case, a merchant reportedly had all his back teeth pulled voluntarily, hoping the suffering would earn her favor and spare him future agony. Spoiler, it didn't work. And then there were the curses. Oh, the curses. Ever wish tooth pain on someone? In the Middle Ages, that was practically a pastime. People cursed each other with worms of the jaw, or invoked spells that made teeth ache like the burning coals of the devil's hearth. If someone wronged you, you didn't slash their tires. You got a priest to hex their molars. Charms and amulets also had a big moment during this era. One popular item? A small bone carved with biblical verses, meant to be worn inside the mouth during Mass. Another? Dried toad feet tied to your chin with red thread. It looked ridiculous, but hey, if your molars felt like they were auditioning for Dante's Inferno, you'd try anything too. Historians still argue whether these rituals were more symbolic than genuinely believed. But what's clear is that people took their teeth seriously. Maybe because they didn't have much else. In a world without Netflix, protein powder, or electric toothbrushes, a toothache wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a spiritual crisis, a community event, a week-long saga of prayer, pain, and possibly toad parts. Some beliefs got even more surreal. In parts of rural France, it was thought that swearing too much could make your teeth fall out one by one. Children were warned, "Speak foul, and your mouth shall crumble like old bread." In some regions, singing during a thunderstorm could invite mouth rot, because apparently the heavens hated music as much as dental health. And yet, nestled in all this madness were the seeds of empathy. People wanted to help one another. Tooth pain was so widespread, so universal, that entire towns would rally behind someone in agony. Neighbors brought herbal poultices, priests blessed vinegar, women whispered folk cures passed down through generations, hoping something would finally ease the torment. A particularly heartwarming tale comes from a 13th century convent, where one nun kept a diary of local ailments. In it, she describes using warmed milk and clove oil on another sister's jaw, followed by a lullaby sung in Latin. Not exactly FDA approved, but surprisingly gentle for the time. That's the thing, underneath all the superstition, there was a real desire to soothe suffering, even if the methods were a little imaginative, and you can't really blame them. Pain makes poets of us all, and in an age where every toothache was a question and every answer had incense smoke, or frog legs in it. People did the best they could. They couldn't explain plaque or root canals, but they understood hurt. They knew how it crept into your sleep, broke your concentration, stole your appetite. So they turned to stories, saints who shared their pain, curses that explained the randomness, superstitions that gave them a shred of control. Because when your mouth is on fire and your neighbor's only advice is to put crushed nettles in your sock and walk backwards at dawn, at least it feels like you're doing something. It's easy to laugh now, sure. Toad feet, garlic pillows, angry saints with dental vendettas. But the emotional logic was sound. Pain needed purpose. And if sin or spirits were the price, at least that made it personal. At least it made it manageable. So as you drift tonight, jaw relaxed, maybe take a second to be glad your molars aren't acting up. And if they are, hey, at least you don't have to consult a monk, a goat, and 3 river stones before getting help. And remember, if a saint ever shows up in a dream offering you mouth advice, maybe skip the voluntary tooth extractions. Just a suggestion. You wake up with the same pulsing throb in your jaw, but this time, there's a sense of grim resolve. You've whispered the prayers. You've slept with garlic on your pillow. You've considered the dried toad foot thing. But let's be real. What you need now isn't divine intervention. It's someone with the guts to do something about the pain. So you shuffle down the uneven cobblestones, your mouth clenched tight, not from dignity but from the sheer fear that one wrong step will jolt that rotten tooth into a new level of torment. The town square is already humming with the day's business. Chickens squabbling under carts, children chasing dogs, and, in the middle of it all, a strange but familiar sight. The striped pole of the barber surgeon. Yes, that barber. The same one who gives your neighbor a decent beard trim on Sundays is also your best shot at tooth removal. Because in the medieval world, specialization wasn't really a thing. Professions overlapped, like a Renaissance Venn diagram gone rogue. If you were good with blades or fire, you could probably lance a boil, sew a wound, or yank a tooth. Barber surgeons were a particularly colorful bunch. They handled everything from minor surgeries to amputations, battlefield triage, and, of course, dental extractions. Their toolkit looked like something between a torture kit and a fishing tackle box. And honestly, that wasn't far off. They weren't alone, though. Dentistry was so informal back then that nearly anyone could declare themselves a tooth puller. Need your molar removed? You've got options. The local blacksmith, who already works with iron and heat and has surprisingly good leverage. A traveling peddler who might pull your tooth between selling lace and playing the flute. The midwife who knows her herbs and has a sturdy pair of hands. The town drunk, who once successfully pulled his own tooth and never lets anyone forget it. You really have to admire the wild practicality of it all. In a society where survival depended on improvisation, the idea of a job being official was almost quaint. If you were tough, brave, or just confident enough, you could be a dentist for the day, and people would line up. There's a recorded case in 1271 of a blacksmith in northern Italy who moonlighted as a tooth yanker so successfully that he became known as the Molar Man of Milan. Not exactly royal title material, but his customers swore by his skills, or maybe just swore during them. In crowded market squares, impromptu extractions were a common sight. Imagine it. A man sits on a stool, mouth agape, sweat already pouring down his temples. The barber surgeon stands above him, wielding an iron instrument that looks suspiciously like tongs borrowed from the fireplace. A crowd gathers. Someone starts betting on how long it'll take. A child claps, and then, crunch, a brief scream, a spray of something unpleasant. Cheers all around. Tooth pulling was equal parts medical procedure and street theater. Some towns even had designated performers who'd hype up the crowd before each extraction, as if that somehow lessened the trauma. They'd joke, sing, or do sleight-of-hand tricks to distract the soon-to-be toothless. It was healthcare, but make it vaudeville. Historians still debate whether these extractions were more painful or terrifying. But there's consensus on one thing. They worked, sometimes. The key was speed. If the tooth came out clean and whole, the patient had a decent chance of recovering. If it shattered mid-yank, well, hopefully someone nearby knew how to brew poppy tea. The tools were rarely sterilized and often reused. The concept of germs was still centuries away. So between the pulling, poking, and occasional chiseling, infections were common. A botched extraction might lead to abscesses, blood poisoning, or an unplanned appointment with the village gravedigger. And yet, people kept coming back, because the alternative, living with constant searing pain, was worse. At least with a barber surgeon, you had hope, or at the very least, a dramatic story to tell over your next bowl of pottage. Now, let's talk about tools. The most notorious was the dental pelican, a bizarre contraption that looked like a bird beak crossed with a wrench. It gripped the tooth and twisted, ideally removing it in one gruesome motion. If that didn't work, out came the tooth key, a brutal device that turned the tooth like a doorknob until it popped loose. Think of it like a corkscrew, but less fun. Neither tool was precise. The tooth key, in particular, had a knack for crushing neighboring teeth in the process. Many people left their dental appointments missing more teeth than they planned. There's even a case from 1423 where a man came in to get one molar pulled and left with an empty jaw on the left side. Oops. Of course, some extractions were done with even more enthusiasm. If you saw a blacksmith instead of a barber, chances are he used pliers. Not dental pliers, just regular, forge-grade iron tongs. There are stories of blacksmiths heating them slightly to kill the demons inside the tooth. That's one way to justify second-degree burns on your lips. And if things went really south, if the tooth wouldn't budge, if the patient screamed too much, if the crowd grew restless, out came the hammer and chisel. That's right, blunt force dentistry. The practitioner would brace the chisel against the root, raise the hammer, and wham. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it worked too well, and the jaw cracked. Still, some people swore by the technique. One folk remedy suggested biting down on a wooden stick while someone smote the aching place with purpose. Not precision, purpose, as if a clear intention could compensate for the lack of training. It was like motivational speaking meets dentistry. This era of hands-on, open-air dental care created a kind of mythology around tooth pullers. Some were feared, some were revered, many were both. A tooth puller named Brother Aldwin became so famous in 14th century York that he had his own catchphrase, "Out by God's mercy," which he apparently shouted just before every yank. And there's something endearing about that. Brutal, yes, but also strangely human. These were people trying to make sense of a world without Novocaine, without antiseptics, without any guarantee that what they were doing wouldn't make things worse. But they did it anyway because they had to, because people were in pain, because someone had to step up and say, "All right, let's get that sucker out." So as you lie back tonight, safe in a world of reclining chairs and numbing gels, take a moment to appreciate the bizarre legacy of these early dental dabblers. They were improvisers, risk-takers, part healer, part performer. And sure, maybe they also gave you tetanus, but sometimes they gave you peace. Just maybe avoid anyone wielding fireplace tongs near your face. The chair, if you can call it that, is a rickety wooden stool. There are no armrests, no cushions, no soothing waterfall sounds in the background. Just the soft creak of timber beneath you, and the gentle clang of iron tools being arranged on a nearby table. The dentist, today, a one-eyed barber with forearms like tree trunks, gives you a nod that's somehow both comforting and ominous. Welcome to the medieval dental toolkit. It's less medical instrument, and more unholy alliance between a torture chamber and a hardware store. But hey, who needs finesse when you've got brute force and a general sense of where the tooth lives? Let's take a little inventory, shall we? First up, the tooth key. We mentioned it earlier, but it deserves a closer look, or maybe a second glance, followed by a slow, nervous backstep. Shaped like an old-fashioned door key, it has a curved metal claw designed to hook around the tooth. Once it's in place, the entire tool is twisted until the tooth either comes out or something cracks. Spoiler alert, often both. Then there's the dental pelican, named not for its gentle nature, but for its resemblance to a pelican's beak. This medieval monstrosity was made for gripping, levering, and, if we're honest, snapping teeth out of the skull. Think of it like a crowbar, but smaller and way more personal. And when the pelican didn't work, you guessed it, hammer and chisel. Historians still argue whether these tools were borrowed from blacksmiths or specifically forged for dentistry. It's a blurry line, really. A tool for cracking horseshoes doesn't feel that different from one used to dislodge an upper molar when you think about it, which you probably shouldn't, especially before bed. There were also forceps, some delicate, others as elegant as barbecue tongs. Not sanitized, of course. No gloves, no antiseptic wipes, just a rinse in a basin of cold water and a shrug. If the last patient had a contagious infection, well, fingers crossed. A lesser-known but still real tool? The dental drill, though not the electric kind. This was a hand-cranked, screechy little device made to bore into a tooth. No anesthesia, no precision speed control, just whirring, shrieking metal against enamel. It's like a tiny torture windmill designed by someone with zero understanding of nerves. And let's not forget the cheek retractor, which, brace yourself, was literally just a curved hook used to yank your mouth open. Its medieval nickname? The Angel's Hook. Why angelic? No idea. Maybe because if you survived the procedure, you'd be meeting angels soon enough. But not all tools were steel and iron. Some were more natural. Bone picks, fish spines, and sharpened wood slivers were occasionally used in folk remedies, especially in rural areas far from town centers. If you're grimacing right now, that's correct. You should be. So how were these tools actually used? Picture this. You, mouth open, jaw clenched, sweat already running down your spine. The tooth key is inserted, awkwardly angled, probably jabbing your gum on the way in. The dentist, half surgeon, half butcher, twists hard. There's a wet crunch, maybe a splintering noise. If you're lucky, it's over. If you're not, it's round two. And through it all, the audience watches. Yes, audience. Because tooth pulling was a public spectacle. People gathered around like it was a puppet show, except instead of marionettes, it was your face jerking back as a molar made its dramatic exit. Children watched. Old ladies placed bets. Merchants sold roasted chestnuts. It was a vibe. Of course, there were risks. Teeth didn't always come out clean. Fractured roots could lead to weeks of infection, facial swelling, or worse. And some practitioners were clumsy or overzealous. There's one case from a town in Bavaria where a barber accidentally pulled the wrong tooth, apologized, and promptly tried again. You don't want dentistry done by someone who treats your mouth like a game of whack-a-mole. Still, for many people, these tools offered hope. Terrifying hope, but hope nonetheless. Because in a world where pain meant helplessness, even the crude swing of a chisel could feel like progress. And not all medieval dentists were brutes. Some actually studied anatomy, rudimentary though it was. The Salernitan School of Medicine in southern Italy taught medical theory, including rudimentary oral care. Their textbooks even recommended certain instruments for different teeth, broader tools for molars, narrower ones for incisors. A thoughtful touch, considering most people still thought teeth had tiny worms inside. Here's a fun tidbit. In some places, patients were encouraged to bite down on leather straps during a procedure, not just to muffle screams, but to keep them from biting the dentist. Occupational hazard, apparently. Even stranger. There were people who collected teeth, sometimes from the tools themselves. A successful extraction might be mounted on a necklace or displayed on a charm bracelet. You might see a merchant with a molar around his neck, boasting, "This little guy nearly killed me, but I won." Nothing says fashion like personal trauma jewelry. Despite the terror of it all, there was innovation. The tools evolved over centuries, getting slightly more precise, slightly less horrifying. By the late Middle Ages, some dentists were even carving wooden handles for better grip, meaning fewer slips, fewer extra holes in your cheek. Progress. One tool that deserves a special shout-out is the mouth mirror. Yes, the same type your dentist uses today to peer into your oral abyss. Medieval versions were rudimentary and often fogged instantly, but they were revolutionary. Instead of yanking teeth blind, a dentist could actually see what they were doing. Sort of. If the candlelight hit just right. In some wealthier towns, dentists had actual studios, with chairs, proper tables, even shelves to line up their grim collection of tools. There's a 14th century record of a Parisian tooth house, featuring walls hung with extracted teeth like badges of honor. Some of them were painted gold, probably not for hygiene, just flair. Still, even in those rarefied spaces, the hammer and chisel lingered. Why? Because no matter how advanced the toolkit became, some teeth just didn't budge. Impacted molars, deep-rooted canines, the dreaded fang of the devil, as one practitioner called it. When finesse failed, blunt force stepped in. But let's be honest, some of these tools existed less out of medical need and more out of a kind of shared madness. The belief that pain could be beaten into submission, that suffering, if inflicted quickly and with iron, might finally surrender. So tonight, while you drift into that half-sleep between dreams and reality, think of those tools clinking together in the candlelit silence, not with menace, but with strange mercy, because as crude as they were, they represented action, effort, hope in the only forms they knew. And thank your lucky stars that your mouth has never met the business end of a pelican. The room smells like burning herbs and wet leather. The light flickers, probably from a tallow candle that's dripping fat onto a nearby table. You can hear muffled footsteps above, and the slow scrape of metal against wood as the dentist, or barber surgeon, or whatever you want to call him, prepares for what comes next. You're sitting on something that's either a stool or an overturned barrel. Either way, it's not built for comfort. This is a dental clinic, medieval style. More accurately, it's a back room off a main hall, or a corner of someone's barn, or even the shady side of a market stall with a decent tarp. But if you're lucky, really lucky, you might find yourself in one of the so-called tooth chambers in larger towns. These were actual rooms, sometimes even with a chair that reclined a little, if you can call that progress. And yet, despite the humble setting, the atmosphere feels charged. You're not just visiting a dentist, you're entering the lion's den. Because in a world without regulated medicine, without antiseptics or lighting or licensing boards, getting a tooth pulled was a leap of faith, or desperation. Picture it. Walls lined with jars of pickled roots, cracked vials of mystery oil, maybe a stuffed badger in the corner. Because someone once said badgers have strong teeth and maybe their spirit helps. The tools lie gleaming with a slightly sticky sheen, lit by the candlelight. Tongs, hooks, the infamous pelican, a rag soaked in wine for your mouth, or possibly your eyes, depending on how squeamish you are, and always the smell of iron and herbs. Let's talk setting, because medieval dental spaces weren't just about tools. They were immersive sensory experiences. People genuinely believed that certain smells had healing properties. Sage, rosemary, and mint were commonly burned or boiled in water before a procedure. Not necessarily for sanitation, though the accidental antibacterial properties didn't hurt, but because they drove out evil spirits. Historians still argue whether this was more psychological than spiritual, whether the rituals helped because they gave patients something to focus on, besides the sound of their own molars cracking. But one thing is certain, everyone had their own version of a dental dungeon. Some barbers worked in open air, under market awnings. Others kept small rooms behind taverns. And in larger cities, dental halls popped up where multiple practitioners would operate side by side, like a very chaotic group practice. Walk in, scream once, and leave with one fewer tooth and maybe a tankard of ale if you were lucky. Now, let's talk pain, because at the center of every medieval dental room was an unavoidable reality. This was going to hurt. A lot. The ambient sounds of these clinics often included muffled groans, deep breathing, sudden shouts, and, if the practitioner was experienced, nervous singing. Some dentists sang to distract their patients. Others encouraged you to sing, loudly, supposedly helped. There are reports of dentists humming psalms, monks chanting while working, and one well-known barber in Prague who whistled like a songbird through every extraction. Maybe it was his way of calming patients, or maybe he just liked birds. Hard to say. In some regions, patients would bring friends or family members to hold them down. Not metaphorically, literally. One person bracing the shoulders, another gripping the legs. The dentist would lean in with a tooth key, mutter something vaguely optimistic, and twist. There's something disturbingly communal about the whole thing. Pain wasn't private. Everyone participated. And once your tooth was out, you weren't just dismissed. You were cheered, congratulated, sometimes given a sip of brandy or a scrap of bread. It was like finishing a medieval marathon with fewer teeth and more blood, and if the procedure didn't go well, if the root snapped, or the jaw cracked, or infection set in, well, you became a cautionary tale. "Don't go to Tom," someone would whisper. "He cracked my cousin's face like a walnut." Reputation mattered, and in towns without Yelp, word of mouth, pun absolutely intended, was everything. Let's not forget the improvisation. Every dental space, no matter how humble, came equipped with backup plans. If the tools didn't work, use a knife. If the patient passed out, splash them with vinegar. If the blood wouldn't stop, hot iron. Cauterization was the go-to for everything from tooth sockets to battle wounds. One dental manual from the 15th century calmly advised, if the bleeding be great, press the iron to the hole until the scent of burning ceases. Romantic. And if you were squeamish about blood, tough. There were no partitions, no sterile gloves, no effort to hide the gore. You saw the patient before you stagger out, mouth stuffed with rags. You smelled the scorched bone. You heard every scream, and still you waited your turn. Oddly enough, medieval dental rooms did have some early attempts at comfort. Some practitioners burned lavender or chamomile to ease nerves. Others played music, lutes, flutes, even bells. And in a few records, there are mentions of tooth pillows, small linen sacks filled with dried herbs that patients clutched or bit down on. One particularly compassionate barber in Bruges offered tooth tokens, little carved stones shaped like molars that patients could take home after a procedure. It wasn't medical, it wasn't even sanitary, but it made people feel seen, like their pain meant something, and pain, in the medieval world, always meant something. It was never just biological, it was spiritual, social, symbolic. The dental room wasn't just a place for extraction, it was a theater, a shrine, and sometimes a battlefield. In fact, some tooth pullers doubled as storytellers. They'd distract patients with tales of brave knights, sea monsters, or haunted molars. This one, they'd say, holding up a yellowed tooth, was cursed by a witch, cost the last man 2 dreams and a week of hallucinations. Truth? Probably not. Effective? Extremely. Of course, there were those who didn't believe in stories, who didn't trust the herbs, or the chants, or the well-meaning humming. For them, a visit to the dental room was a grim necessity. They sat down, closed their eyes, clenched their fists, and prayed that this would be over soon. That the pain, that ever-present background noise of medieval life, would finally quiet. Because that was the point, really. Not comfort, not beauty, just silence, relief. A stillness in the mouth, in the jaw, in the mind. So next time you recline in a clean, cushioned chair with a little suction tube and a hygienist who offers you sunglasses, remember the medieval dental room. The heat, the iron, the closeness of breath and sweat. The smell of rosemary masking the scent of blood. The hope that maybe, just maybe this time, the tooth comes out whole. And most of all, remember that people have always fought for relief. Even if it meant walking into a room full of strangers, sitting on a rickety stool, and trusting someone with a chisel and a prayer. You're sitting there, still groggy from the trauma, or maybe the wine, after your visit to the town's most decorated barber surgeon. Your face is numb from sheer shock, and yet somehow your jaw still pulses with pain like a heartbeat made of fire. The molar might be gone, but your body hasn't quite gotten the memo. And now you're asking the most unhinged yet logical question a medieval patient could ask. Wait, did he just use a hammer? Yes, he did. Because in a world of clumsy instruments, resistant teeth, and absolutely no Novocaine, the hammer and chisel combo wasn't a dental horror story, it was protocol. This wasn't Plan B. For some teeth, it was Plan A. And it wasn't done in haste or madness. Well, not always. Sometimes it was the most direct path to mercy. Let's unpack the logic. Molars are tough, thick, multi-rooted, buried deep in bone. In the medieval mouth, already battered by coarse bread, poor hygiene, and general nutritional chaos, they often decayed right down to the gum line. That made them impossible to grip with even the best of forceps, which back then weren't much better than glorified salad tongs. So what did you do when pliers couldn't get the job done? You reached for the chisel, then the hammer, and hoped your aim was true. Now, don't imagine a sledgehammer. This was a small, heavy-headed mallet, often made of iron or dense wood. The chisel was a narrow blade, sometimes curved to better match the arc of the jaw. The dentist, or barber, blacksmith, or desperate uncle would position the chisel at an angle, resting the tip just against the base of the tooth, and then, with a breath, a muttered prayer, and probably a shot of ale, he'd bring the hammer down. One clean strike. That was the goal. If done correctly, the tooth would pop out like a cork, root and all. If done poorly, well, teeth could shatter, gums could split, jaws could crack. And yes, there are documented cases of patients losing chunks of mandible. It wasn't common, but it happened. Historians still argue whether the hammer and chisel method originated in surgery or blacksmithing. Some believe it evolved from battlefield amputations, where speed and brute force were the only tools against infection. Others think it came from the forge, where metal was split and shaped with heat and hammer, and someone eventually thought, hey, what if we tried this on a human face? Regardless of origin, the method spread. By the late 13th century, it was known throughout much of Europe, especially in regions where molar decay was rampant. In parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, it was even considered the preferred method for difficult extractions. There are records of traveling dentists advertising swift hammer services. Swift, not painless, just swift. Oddly enough, some patients requested the hammer. Why? Because once word got around that it was faster, sometimes done in under 10 seconds, it became the medieval version of ripping off the Band-Aid. Yes, it might break something, but at least it would be over. There's a story from a village in Bohemia about a woman who refused to let anyone touch her molar until the blessed chisel was warmed by fire. The heat, she believed, would drive out the toothworm. And in a way, it did. The worm, or rather the remains of a decayed pulp, were indeed removed, along with a small section of her jawbone. She reportedly said it was the best night's sleep in months. Let's pause here and consider the sensory details. The wooden stool under you shifts slightly as you tilt your head back. The chisel, cold and sharp, is pressed gently into your gum line. You squeeze your eyes shut, clutching a leather strap. You hear the rustle of robes, the whisper of someone behind you reciting Psalm 38. And then, crack, not a scream. Just a sudden silence, followed by a warm flood of blood and a lopsided sense of relief. It's awful, it's crude, but in the medieval calculus of pain and options, it worked. Often enough to become legend. Some dentists even developed signature techniques. A Flemish barber named Klaus was famous for double-tap chiseling. 2 swift strikes before the tooth even knew it was being evicted. Another practitioner in Florence claimed he could extract a molar with a single blow before the candle's wax could drip. A bold claim, considering wax drips notoriously fast. Now, before you assume every chisel-hammer combo was a death sentence, here's a surprising twist. Some patients recovered remarkably well. With clean extractions and a bit of luck, the body closed the wound naturally. A rinse with salt water or vinegar helped stave off infection, and in rare cases the socket even healed so cleanly that people believed the mouth spirits had been appeased. Of course, there were also those who weren't so lucky. In one infamous case, a baker in London bled so heavily after a failed chisel extraction that the town physician had to cauterize the wound with a red-hot spoon. Yes, a spoon. It wasn't even the right tool, but it was metal, and it was available. The man lived, but never baked again. Another tale tells of a knight who insisted on having a molar removed with his own ceremonial dagger. He thought it would please the gods of war. The barber agreed, and, shockingly, the tooth came out clean. But the knight passed out anyway, probably from the pain. When he awoke, he'd bitten clean through his own tongue. Divine justice? Maybe. Or just a bad idea, poorly executed. Interestingly, some religious texts actually endorsed the hammer method. They claimed it was swift and righteous, a symbolic act of casting out inner demons. One monk wrote, "As the nail was driven into the flesh of Christ, so too must we drive out the sin that hides in the hollow of the tooth." Graphic. But hey, it was the Middle Ages. The hammer even found its way into folklore. In some regions, it was said that a well-aimed dental strike could knock the madness out. Superstition blurred with medicine. Pain was punishment, and its removal required violence. People saw the hammer not just as a tool, but as a purifier. Harsh? Absolutely, but strangely poetic. And here's something you might not expect. Even centuries later, the hammer and chisel method lingered in remote regions. As late as the 1800s, rural communities in parts of Scotland and the Balkans still used similar techniques. Without access to modern care, they fell back on what they knew, however brutal. Oral history passed it down like a grim family recipe. So as you lie back now, drifting deeper into that sleepy haze, consider this. Your ancestors, your actual genetic predecessors, once sat bravely or foolishly, while someone hovered above them with a hammer. They took the hit, faced the pain, and then walked out with one less tooth and maybe a strange kind of peace. And what's the modern version of that? A vibrating chair, a soft bib, a polite reminder to floss. Kinda makes you want to send a thank you card to history, doesn't it? But maybe keep the hammer out of it. The pain has dulled, but it's still there, lingering like a forgotten song, humming beneath your jawline. The molar is gone, sure, but the hole in your gum is more than just physical. It's a portal to the harshest truth of medieval life. Pain wasn't optional, it was expected. And while the hammer may have done its job, there was still one small problem left to deal with: anesthesia, or more accurately, the complete and utter lack of it. In our world, the word anesthesia evokes images of IV drips, gas masks, and the strange moment when you blink and it's suddenly 2 hours later. But back then, not even close. If you were lucky, you got something strong enough to blur the edges of your agony. If you weren't, you got a prayer and a rag to bite. So let's explore the dreamy, drowsy, and downright questionable world of medieval pain management. First stop, wine. Cheap, warm, and heavily spiced, it was the go-to numbing agent for centuries. Not because it worked well, but because it was everywhere. People would drink until their lips went numb, hoping the rest of their face followed. Red wine was preferred for its heat, which was believed to stun the spirits of pain. Not exactly accurate, but if you're 3 cups deep, who's counting? Then there was opium. Yes, that opium. Derived from the poppy, it was known in the medieval world, and occasionally mixed into medicinal pastes or tinctures. The problem? Dosage. There were no measuring spoons or charts, just a handful of crushed pods stirred into wine or honey. If you took too little, it did nothing. Too much, and, well, you might not be worried about your tooth anymore, or anything ever again. Another option was mandrake root, a legendary plant believed to scream when uprooted. Nope, not real, and capable of putting people into a deep, trance-like sleep. Actually somewhat real. Mixed with wine or chewed raw, it could dull sensation. But mandrake was fickle. Some reacted mildly, others hallucinated fire-breathing cats. One unlucky monk reportedly spent 4 days, convinced his tooth had climbed out of his mouth, and was whispering sermons from the rafters. Still, despite the risks, it was widely used. In fact, early surgical techs recommend rubbing mandrake paste on the gums before a procedure. Not to numb the pain entirely, but to slow the brain just enough to make it tolerable. That was the best anyone hoped for. Tolerable. Other plants joined the party. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was occasionally used in tiny amounts for its numbing effects. Henbane, hemlock, and datura all made appearances in folk remedies, and while they could ease the pain, they could also kill you. It was kind of a gamble, relief or ruin depending on the day. In some regions, a substance called dwale was brewed, a medieval sedative made from wine, bile, opium, lettuce juice, and vinegar. Dwale was like the medieval version of a knock-you-out smoothie. Surgeons used it before operations, hoping it would render the patient unconscious long enough to remove an abscess or, amputate a limb. For dental procedures, it might just dull the senses. But again, dosing was a wild guess. Historians still argue whether dwale was truly effective, or just a placebo bolstered by a lot of wine and good luck. But it was common enough to show up in texts from multiple countries. It's basically the medieval version of take 2 shots and let's hope for the best. For the more religiously inclined, anesthesia came in the form of prayers and rituals. Some patients believed that invoking certain saints could block pain. Saint Apollonia, as we've mentioned, was the go-to, but others called upon Saint Lucy or Saint Sebastian, whispering Latin psalms between clenched teeth. One bizarre but well-documented tradition involved tooth charms, small scrolls inscribed with holy verses, rolled tightly, and placed in the mouth during the procedure. This wasn't meant to protect the tooth so much as confuse the pain. If the demon of agony got distracted reading the scripture, maybe he'd leave you alone. That was the theory anyway. And when herbs and holy words failed, there were more physical options. Hypnosis, sort of. While no one used that term, some monks and mystics practiced trance techniques. By chanting rhythmically and encouraging focused breathing, they'd guide patients into altered mental states. Think of it as proto-meditation. Some even claimed to leave their bodies during pain, watching the tooth be pulled from above like a mildly horrifying out-of-body slideshow. One traveling healer in 14th century Wales was said to soothe patients by stroking their temples and singing in monotone for an hour. Did it help? Who knows? But at least you were distracted long enough to forget what was about to happen. And distraction was half the battle. Here's where things get really fringe. In parts of Scandinavia, people used cold therapy, pressing snow, ice blocks, or even frozen stones to the face before an extraction. This actually had some numbing effect, although the logistics were tricky. Snow doesn't last long indoors, and no one wants their dentist to pause mid-yank to run outside for more frost. Then there's pressure point theory, early versions of acupuncture and reflexology. Some believe that pressing or binding certain parts of the body could redirect pain. Tie a cord around your ankle tight enough, and maybe your tooth won't hurt as much. Spoiler, it still did, but the human mind is weird. Sometimes the ritual helped, if only by giving you something else to think about. In moments of desperation, some patients just bit down and went for it. No herbs, no charms, just raw medieval courage, which probably looked a lot like shaking in your boots while someone counted down from 3 and then swung a chisel at your jaw. It's easy to judge from the comfort of a 21st century couch, but the truth is, people were doing the best they could. They knew pain, they feared it, but they also respected it as something sacred, even transformative. Pain wasn't just something to run from, it was something to endure, to survive, to learn from. Even in noble households, with access to imported spices and educated physicians, pain was unavoidable. Queen Elizabeth Thurnes famously refused dental care because of her terror of pain, even as her teeth blackened and her breath became a diplomatic hazard. Her personal physician once attempted to coax her into treatment by offering opium-laced sweets. She threw them at him. Royalty or not, no one wanted to lie back and let someone gently chisel their face open. And so, the rituals continued. The prayers, the potions, the bizarre leaf-wrapped mixtures of parsley and sheep bile. Some worked, most didn't. But they offered something critical: hope. A sense that the pain wasn't permanent, that someone, somewhere, had figured out a way to make it hurt less. So tonight, as you settle into your pillow, trace your tongue over your own teeth. No throbbing, no swelling, no incense burning on your nightstand, no poppy wine in your glass, just calm, and maybe say a silent thank you for clove oil, for modern medicine, and for the fact that your dentist probably doesn't offer hallucinations as part of the service package, unless you ask nicely. Your cheek still tingles from the ghost of an ache that once ruled your life. You've survived the chisel, the hammer, and the oddly soothing chanting of a man named Godwin, who smelled like cheese and mint. But before you drift off into well-earned relief, let's open your eyes, just for a moment, to a sharp contrast that shaped medieval dentistry in ways few ever talk about. Class, wealth, status, all the stuff we pretend doesn't matter when it comes to pain. Well, back then, it absolutely did. Let's talk about teeth in the Middle Ages. Not just as body parts, but as social currency. Your mouth said a lot about who you were, and depending on your rank in the feudal pyramid, your dental care, if it could be called that, looked very, very different. If you were a peasant, chances are your dental hygiene routine involved cold water, rough linen, and maybe chewing on a hazel twig, if you had one lying around. Your diet was mostly grains, root vegetables, the occasional scrap of meat, if your lord was feeling generous, and lots of coarse hand-ground bread. That bread, it wasn't sifted, and it often contained bits of stone dust from the millstone. Over time, that ground your teeth down like sandpaper. It was like brushing with gravel 3 times a day. You might not have had many sweets, but that didn't spare you from decay. Infection, abscesses, and exposed roots were common. So was just yanking a tooth out with your own fingers or letting it rot until it fell out on its own. Natural selection by molar. Now, if you were wealthy, a noble, a landowner, or even just a well-off merchant, you had access to slightly better things. You might own a silver toothpick. You probably had a servant to bring you warm water for rinsing. Maybe even your own stash of cloves or mint leaves. But even with all the cinnamon and rose water you could afford, there was one thing that equalized everyone. Toothaches still hurt. Wealth didn't come with Novocaine. A golden goblet didn't dull the sting of nerve pain. So when aristocrats got oral infections, they too cried, screamed, or sent for the nearest poor soul, willing to hack at their face until the agony stopped. But here's where the class divide really showed: the treatment. Noble dental care often involved more ceremony than science. A noblewoman might see a surgeon trained in the courts of France. Someone who wore robes, quoted Aristotle, and burned exotic herbs while muttering in Latin. The tools were cleaner, the linen softer, and the wine older. Still no anesthesia, but perhaps a little more gentleness. Maybe even a pillow. Royalty could even afford imported ingredients. Powdered pearl, coral paste, rare resins. Were they effective? Not really. But they smelled amazing and came in gilded boxes, so who's complaining? The upper class also had access to early cosmetics for teeth. Blackened teeth, ironically, became a trend in some circles. In Japan, they were deliberately stained for beauty and status. In Europe, some aristocrats darkened their teeth with herbs to match Queen Elizabeth's famously decayed smile. Because if the monarch had bad teeth, well, so should you. It's medieval peer pressure with a side of gingivitis. And yet, even with the glitz and glam, the outcomes were often just as horrifying. Because expensive doesn't mean effective when the best medical theory you've got is based on balancing hot, cold, wet, and dry humors in the body. Too much black bile? Better drain your jaw with a knife. Rich or poor, it still came down to steel and suffering. Now, let's shift back to the common folk. Those whose entire dental arsenal consisted of hope and maybe a coin or two. They relied heavily on folk healers, traveling herbalists, and granny wisdom passed down through generations. These healers worked with what they had: crushed fennel, vinegar soaks, mashed garlic poultices. Some of it actually worked, kind of. In fact, archaeological digs show that many peasants lost teeth early, but managed to live fairly comfortably without them. Gums toughened, diets adjusted, and in some ways they suffered less than the nobles, who kept rotting teeth in their mouths long past the point of no return, because appearances mattered. You couldn't show up to court missing a canine, but you could keep it, black and cracked, and pray your breath didn't give you away. There's a record of a nobleman in Burgundy who reportedly carried perfumed cloths to bite upon during conversations, masking both the stench and the pain. Another story tells of a queen who had a servant trained solely to feed her pre-chewed meats because her molars were unusable. Royalty, where dignity goes to die with a silver spoon full of mashed goose. And then there's the question of access. Who pulled your teeth often depended on what you could pay. Poor? Your neighbor with pliers and strong arms. Modestly wealthy? A barber surgeon who'd seen a tooth before. Upper class? A physician with fancy robes and maybe a Latin phrasebook. Royalty? A foreign-trained medical expert who also read horoscopes and claimed your dental issues were due to Saturn's placement in your astrological chart. Historians still argue whether these elite physicians actually helped or just inflicted slower, more expensive damage. But the belief was there. The richer the healer, the more likely they were to succeed. And sometimes, that belief was all the relief people got. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tooth transplants were a thing, sort of. In the 15th century, it became fashionable among the rich to have missing teeth replaced with someone else's, usually a poor person's. The donor was paid a few coins. The tooth was yanked and implanted into the rich person's mouth. No sterilization, no compatibility testing. Just jam it in there and hope it takes. Spoiler, it almost never did. But for a moment, you could smile like nothing had happened, until the infection set in. Then you paid someone even more to take it out again, the circle of life. And yet, there was one thing that bridged all classes: fear. Rich or poor, when someone said, "Open wide," your stomach dropped. The tools didn't care about your lineage, the pain didn't discriminate, and no amount of coins in your purse could buy you immunity from the terrifying snap of a root giving way. So as you lie here now, tucked into your blankets, think of the thousands before you, peasants and princes, who faced the same horror, who clutched their cheeks, winced at every cold wind, and weighed the awful question, do I keep the tooth, or do I risk the cure? And be glad you live in a world where the answer doesn't depend on your rank. Because mercy should never be measured by coin. Let's wander for a moment, slowly, sleepily, into the strangest corner of medieval dental care, the part that makes even the hammer and chisel seem sensible. Because for every blacksmith with pliers and every noble with a tooth transplant dream, there was also a local healer with a recipe for relief that started with something like, first, find a dead mouse. Yes, really. Dead mice, powdered pearls, crushed emeralds, and so many other things you absolutely, positively should not put in your mouth. But in a world where science hadn't quite caught up to suffering, people used whatever they could find, whatever folklore, faith, or desperation placed in their hands. So let's open the medieval medicine cabinet. Figuratively, of course. No one had actual cabinets, just sacks, shelves, and strange jars, and see what people used to combat the dreaded toothache. Mouse brains. Let's start strong. One documented remedy called for drying the brain of a freshly killed mouse, grinding it into powder, and mixing it with vinegar to form a paste. This was then applied directly to the aching tooth. The logic? Mice gnawed constantly, so their essence might somehow gnaw the pain away. Magical thinking at its squeakiest. Crushed pearls and gemstones. On the opposite end of the spectrum, wealthier patients were encouraged to grind pearls, emeralds, and coral into fine powder, mix it with rose water or honey, and apply the mixture to sore gums. This was less about actual healing and more about social symbolism, because nothing says, "I'm a refined patient," like shoving jewelry in your mouth. Pearls were believed to have cooling, calming properties, while emeralds were thought to ward off evil spirits. Effective? Not really, but it made for some truly luxurious spit. Dragon's blood. No dragons were harmed, probably. Dragon's blood was the name given to a deep red resin harvested from certain trees, especially in the Middle East and Asia. It was ground into powder and used for everything from healing wounds to treating dental pain. Applied to the gums, it gave a tingling sensation, and in some cases, minor antibacterial effect. People believed it had powerful protective properties. Some swore it stopped pain on contact. Others just liked the look of it. Red, vivid, and dramatic, just like a proper medieval cure should be. Burnt bread and soot. For the less glamorously inclined, burnt breadcrumbs mixed with soot and a drop of vinegar made a common poultice. Rubbed onto the gums, it provided minor abrasion and a strong placebo effect. Charcoal does have some cleansing properties, which is why you still see it in modern toothpaste. But back then, it was more like, this feels gritty, that means it's working, right? Spices galore. Cloves were perhaps the most universally accepted toothache remedy. Clove oil contains eugenol, a natural anesthetic and antibacterial compound. Chewing on cloves or applying clove oil directly to the tooth was one of the few things that actually worked. Cinnamon and cardamom also made appearances, mostly for flavor and fragrance. If you were rich, your healer might mix clove oil with ground nutmeg, honey, and mint leaves for a surprisingly effective balm. If you were poor, you chewed the clove and prayed. Animal fats and ashes. A more grim concoction involved pig fat mixed with wood ash. The idea? The heat and fat would melt the ache away. It was warmed slightly and packed into the mouth, sometimes bound with linen to keep it in place. The result was messy, greasy, and deeply unpleasant. Whether it helped is still debated, but if you're busy gagging, maybe you're distracted enough to forget the tooth. Tobacco and alum. In some regions, people chewed tobacco mixed with crushed alum, a mineral salt known for its astringent properties. This mixture burned like fire and probably wasn't great for your soft tissues. But hey, if it stung, it had to be working, right? Honey and onions. One gentler remedy involved slow roasting an onion, then soaking it in honey and applying it warm to the jaw. This at least made sense. The warmth helped blood flow. Honey is antimicrobial, and onions contain compounds with mild anti-inflammatory effects. Plus, it probably tasted better than mouse brains. Urine. Yes, we're going there. Some folk healers recommended rinsing the mouth with fresh morning water, which was exactly what you think it was. It was believed to be sterile and warming. Modern science says, please don't. But at the time, it was seen as a natural purifier, used in remedies for everything from toothache to skin infections. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or mostly confined to specific regions. But the recipes exist in multiple old medical manuscripts. Sometimes you really can taste the past, and wish you hadn't. Incense and smoke. In some towns, people blew herbal smoke directly onto the aching tooth. Burning sage, frankincense, or even cow dung, yes really, produced aromatic plumes that were believed to carry pain away. Sometimes herbs were wrapped in fabric, lit, and held close to the jawline to coax the demon out. Bonus points if you did it during a full moon. Tooth powders. Early toothpastes, if you can call them that, were dry powders made from various ingredients: crushed oyster shells, powdered bones, chalk, and dried herbs. These were rubbed onto the teeth with a cloth or a chewed stick. Some were mildly effective. Others were basically fine grit sandpaper. Either way, it gave your mouth that rustic feel. Oil of brick. Yes, crushed bricks were soaked in oil and applied to the jaw, possibly just because they were red, and red things were thought to absorb bad energy. Or maybe because someone got hit with a brick once and didn't feel their tooth anymore. The logic wasn't always clear, but the desperation always was. You see, in all of these strange concoctions, from luxury pearls to gritty soot, from holy herbs to very questionable mouse parts, there's a common thread. People just wanted the pain to stop. And in the absence of certainty, they turned to anything that offered hope. Whether it was superstition, ritual, or experimental chemistry, these remedies gave people something to hold on to. A routine, a plan. Even if the cure didn't work, the act of curing helped them feel like they were doing something, and sometimes that was enough. So as you drift now, your mouth clean and quiet, your breath steady, consider the long, bizarre history of human resilience. The things we'll put in our mouths, willingly, when the alternative is suffering, and whisper a little thank you to whatever wisdom finally said, maybe don't pack your gums with powdered gemstone. Sleep well, with your modern toothpaste, your floss, and your 0% chance of running into a toad-based remedy tomorrow, unless you're feeling adventurous. In which case, I hear the crushed emerald special is going 2 for 1. You sit up in bed, pressing your tongue against your teeth, just to check. Still all there, still mostly white, still holding strong. And in that quiet moment of gratitude, you might find yourself wondering, but what about them? What about the royals, the crowned heads, the rulers of empires and kingdoms? Surely they had perfect teeth, right? Access to the best healers, rarest spices, the finest clove oil money could buy? Not quite. Because if there's one universal truth in history, it's this: no amount of gold can bribe a toothache. The gums of the great and powerful were just as vulnerable to rot and infection as anyone else's, sometimes more so. And when it came to royalty, the consequences of bad dental health went beyond pain. They could shake empires. Let's start with Queen Elizabeth I, a name synonymous with power, pageantry, and famously terrible teeth. By the later years of her reign, her teeth had blackened and decayed so severely that she reportedly covered her mouth when speaking. Foreign ambassadors noted her breath was strangely sour, and some even found ways to tactfully avoid standing too close. She was terrified of dental procedures. Understandably. Despite access to court physicians and the best herbs and remedies available, she resisted extractions, possibly due to trauma, possibly due to an incident involving a courtier who died from a botched dental surgery. Either way, she chose pain over the possibility of bleeding out in a gilded room. Ironically, her blackened teeth started a trend. The nobility, eager to mimic the queen's appearance, began to darken their own teeth with herbs or pigments. Some even rubbed soot into their molars to achieve that royal smile. And you thought beauty standards were weird now. Moving on to Louis XIII, the Sun King himself. By all accounts, his dental health was not radiant. He had several teeth removed in a single session, without anesthesia, of course. The surgery was so invasive that it tore a hole in the roof of his mouth, creating a permanent fistula between his mouth and nasal cavity. For the rest of his life, he reportedly struggled with speech, eating, and constant infection. The man ruled France, but his molars ruled him. In the Habsburg dynasty, the situation was even more dramatic. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a condition now recognized as mandibular prognathism, caused significant dental misalignment. Paintings show their long, jutting lower jaws and prominent chins, features that led to chewing difficulties and serious speech impediments. One Habsburg archduke reportedly had to have his meat cut into child-sized pieces because he couldn't close his molars properly. Royal marriages were arranged based on lineage, not jaw compatibility, so the trait kept circulating like an unwelcome family heirloom, generation after generation. Historians still debate whether the condition was entirely genetic or made worse by the aristocracy's refusal to marry outside a small circle of noble families. Either way, dentistry wasn't keeping up. And then there's Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and political mastermind. She believed so deeply in astrological dentistry that she refused all oral care on days her court astrologer marked as unfavorable for molar extraction. Her diaries mention days of agony where she clutched her cheek but refused treatment because Mars was in conflict with Mercury. You can imagine how well that went. Even beyond Europe, royalty suffered. In ancient China, during the Ming Dynasty, emperors had their own specialized healers, some of whom used mercury-based mouth rinses to whiten the teeth and cure pain. It didn't work. In fact, mercury is, as we now know, quite toxic. But the idea of beauty through poison was deeply ingrained, and emperors wanted their smiles to gleam. In Mesoamerica, nobles went to great lengths for dental aesthetics, filing their teeth into decorative shapes or inlaying them with jade and turquoise. While not exactly practical, these modifications were status symbols, and while they probably didn't help with function, at least they looked magnificent while chewing maize. Let's not forget the curious case of King Henry VIII, a man known for his appetites, culinary, marital, and political. His diet was heavy in meat, sugar, and wine, and predictably, his teeth paid the price. There are accounts of Henry suffering from severe dental infections, even fevers brought on by abscesses. But like his daughter Elizabeth, he distrusted surgery and avoided extractions. One court chronicler noted that the king's breath was hot and foul, and that his royal bedchamber was often scented with strong herbs. Translation: his mouth was a crime scene. Across the Channel, in Spain, Queen Isabella reportedly lost many of her teeth by her early 40s. She was known for her austere lifestyle, but that didn't save her from decay. She used early tooth powders, containing ash, mint, and ground bone, but these only helped so much. And while she was a devout Catholic and beloved monarch, there's no evidence her prayers made her molars any stronger. In the Russian courts, Tsar Peter the Great was so fascinated by Western medicine that he personally performed dental surgeries on his servants and advisors. No joke, he had a toolkit and everything. He practiced tooth pulling, supposedly as a form of education. Imagine working for someone who could execute you one day, and the next, yank your tooth out for science. What links all these royal cases isn't just bad luck or genetics. It's the intersection of power and fear. These were people surrounded by opulence, commanding armies, making history. But when it came to toothaches, they were just like everyone else, afraid, helpless, willing to try anything that might help, or terrified to try anything at all. They had the means, but not the methods. They had the titles, but not the tools. And despite all the courtiers and cooks, jewels and gowns, A single infected molar could level a monarch like any commoner. It's a strange comfort, isn't it? To know that pain doesn't care who you are, that the throb in your jaw once echoed through royal palaces and under thatched roofs alike, that kings wept, queens whimpered, emperors stuffed cloves between their gums, just like a farmer in the fields. So as you lie here, mouth comfortably closed, nothing stabbing or swelling or screaming inside it, take one last scan with your tongue. Everything intact? Good. You've already outlived most monarchs in dental peace. And in the quiet of your room, surrounded by no palace guards, no velvet curtains, no court astrologer, you can rest easy. Because tonight you are tooth royalty. You've met the kings and queens with bad breath. You've flinched at the hammer, recoiled at the chisel, and made mental notes never to trust a man named Brother Matthias with anything sharper than a butter knife. But now, we turn our attention to one of the most bizarre and long-lasting ideas in medieval dentistry. A theory that stuck around so stubbornly it might as well have had roots in the bone. Toothworms. Yes, worms in your teeth. Chewing, squirming, feasting on your enamel like tiny invisible snakes with a taste for molars. For centuries, this was not just folk superstition, it was accepted science. People across Europe, Asia, and even parts of Africa believed that when you had a toothache, it wasn't because of decay or infection. It was because a little worm had crawled into your tooth and decided to set up camp, rent-free, with no plans to leave. And the best part? People thought they could hear them. A sharp, shrill ache, the worm was squealing, a dull, pulsing throb. That was the worm turning over, getting comfy. Pain when you bit down? The worm didn't like being disturbed. It sounds ridiculous now, but this belief lasted for over 1,000 years. Not because people were foolish, but because it offered something modern science often doesn't. A visual explanation. You couldn't see bacteria, but you could imagine a worm. Something small, tangible, wriggling just beneath the gum line, eating its way through the night. A villain you could picture, a culprit you could blame. This idea wasn't pulled from thin air either. In some rare cases, maggots were found in decayed facial wounds, and they were mistakenly believed to have come from inside the tooth. Combine that with natural tooth pulp decay, which can sometimes smell like rot, and it's not a huge leap for the pre-modern imagination to go, yep, that's a worm. Ancient Babylonian texts mention these creatures. So do Indian Ayurvedic scrolls. In the 8th century, a Syrian physician named al-Baghdadi wrote extensively about methods to kill the toothworm using hot needles and herbal fumes. In fact, fumigation therapy became an entire branch of medieval dental care. Let's walk through that process, shall we? Step 1. You take a small cone made of herbs, usually henbane, garlic, or belladonna, and set it aflame. Step 2. Place the burning mixture beneath a funnel or small pipe that directs the smoke directly into your open mouth. Step 3. Sit very still while smoke fills your sinuses, coats your tongue, and burns your eyes, all in the name of evicting a tiny, invisible worm who may or may not exist. Some healers claim to see black threads emerge after the procedure, likely charred pulp or congealed residue from the smoke. To the observer, evidence, proof. The worm had been cast out, the mouth was purified, and if your pain subsided, even temporarily, that only sealed the belief further. Historians still argue whether the toothworm myth was a metaphor for decay or a literal explanation. Some scholars believe people knew it wasn't an actual worm, but used the idea as a narrative to explain the mysterious progression of dental pain. Others are convinced many took it quite literally, especially given the number of worm removal remedies written down across centuries. Here's a popular one. Mix opium, garlic juice, vinegar, and crushed onion skins into a thick paste. Warm slightly. Apply it to the aching tooth and wait for the worm to surface. What they were actually doing, unknowingly, was numbing the nerve. But the imagery was clear. The worm recoiled. The pain eased. Victory. In some places, toothworm treatments were tied into romantic folklore. Yes, really. In a strange and slightly sweet twist, there were love charms involving teeth. One 15th century French tale involves a young woman who gives her lover a pendant made from her baby tooth. She claims it will protect him from the love worm that makes men go mad with longing and tooth pain. Whether that story started as dental advice or poetic license is unclear, but it's a fascinating collision of health and heart. On the creepier side, some believed that if you dreamed of teeth falling out, it meant someone you loved was unfaithful, or that a worm had begun to breed inside your mouth as punishment. A little romance, a little horror. The medieval way. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, suitors sometimes gifted a tooth as a symbol of devotion. Not a necklace, not a ring, an actual tooth, preferably pulled by the giver themselves. Nothing says, "till death do us part," like handing over your freshly extracted bicuspid with a ribbon tied around it. Even baby teeth got the worm treatment. When a child lost their first tooth, some families would burn it, believing that destroying the tooth would kill any worm inside it and prevent future pain. Others buried it under the hearth or fed it to a dog. This wasn't just tradition, it was dental protection. The idea was that if the worm didn't get to the new tooth, the adult one would grow strong and pain-free. Modern dentists might cringe, but you can see the cultural logic at work. Control the worm, control the pain. Let's talk again about the auditory hallucination part. People swore they could hear the worm moving, especially at night. It might have been jaw tension, gum inflammation, or just the echo of one's own heartbeat inside a swollen jaw. But to a mind conditioned to fear unseen invaders, that faint pulsing sound became the whisper of the worm. There's even a 13th century poem that reads, "The worm within my silver gate doth gnaw and hiss and celebrate. By candle's dim and midnight bell, it dances in my toothy shell." That's either medieval horror or the most niche lullaby ever written. The belief in toothworms finally began to fade around the 1700s, when microscopes revealed bacteria and anatomy texts improved. But even then, the image of the worm clung to popular imagination. Some rural communities still whispered of it well into the 19th century, and honestly, it's not hard to see why. Pain needs a shape, something to blame, something you can fight. A worm, writhing deep inside your tooth, offered a villain you could smoke out, drown in vinegar, or crush with prayer. It was medieval pain science, primitive, vivid, and, in its own odd way, comforting, because if there's a worm, then there's a way to remove it. So as you drift now, think of the many people who slept with clove on their pillow and henbane smoke curling toward the rafters, who tilted their heads, listening, convinced they could hear the tiny invader squirm, who whispered to saints and suitors alike, "Help me, there's something inside," and be glad your toothache, if you ever get one again, doesn't come with squirming metaphors, just a phone call, a waiting room, and a professional with actual training, unless, of course, you still believe in the little worm, in which case, maybe skip the clove and call an exorcist. The flicker of candlelight dances across stone walls. Somewhere outside, a dog howls once, then falls silent. You're lying back now, your jaw finally still, but you can't help thinking, why did people believe pain had to be earned? That it wasn't just biology, but punishment. Tonight, we slide deeper into the darkened, incense-filled spaces where pain wasn't only tolerated, it was theologically necessary. Because in the medieval world, especially when it came to teeth, pain was often seen as divine retribution. Cavities, that wasn't poor hygiene, it was sin made visible. Let's back up. Medieval Christian doctrine taught that the body and soul were inextricably linked. When your soul strayed, through pride, gluttony, lust, or even envy, your body responded. You didn't just feel bad, you became bad. Your flesh mirrored your faults, and nothing mirrored suffering like a howling jaw, inflamed gums, or a molar that ached with every heartbeat. Some theologians wrote that oral pain was the sin of vanity, manifesting itself in the mouth. You smiled too much, spoke out of turn, spent too long admiring yourself in the mirror. God would remind you, through a tooth that rotted slowly, biting back each time you tried to show it off. It wasn't just poetic, it was doctrine. Entire sermons were devoted to the spiritual meaning of pain. A monk in Saxony once wrote, "The mouth is the window of truth. If it lies, let it burn." That's not just theology, it's medical justification wrapped in divine judgment. And the punishment wasn't limited to speech. Eating too well, too richly, too indulgently, that could spark pain too. Sugar, though rare, was associated with the elite, and its effect on the teeth was viewed as divine rebalancing. Too sweet, some preachers said, invites the bitter hand of heaven. Even specific saints were thought to inflict pain for a reason, not out of cruelty, but discipline. Saint Apollonia, beloved as the patroness of toothaches, wasn't just a healer. She was also seen as a stern moral figure, a kind of celestial dental nun who enforced silence, humility, and devotion. If she hurt you, it was for your own good. People prayed to her while in pain, yes, but also for pain as penance. Some flagellants even struck their own jaws with sticks to awaken the sins of the tongue. There are written prayers asking Apollonia to plant in me the ache of purification. It wasn't about healing, it was about deserving it first. That idea, pain as a cleansing fire, saturated the medieval worldview. In some regions, people tied oral pain to lies. If you gossiped, your teeth would loosen. If you cursed, your gums would bleed. If you committed adultery, your tongue would swell with the rot of betrayal. Historians still debate how widespread these ideas were outside monastic life. Were these beliefs deeply internalized by peasants and farmers, or were they confined to the pulpit and the cloister? What we know for sure is this: pain wasn't just something to fix, it was something to reflect on. You weren't simply injured, you were being taught. In one court record from 14th century Bruges, a woman was denied help by the local healer because she refused to confess her sins first. He claimed her toothache came from unrepented bitterness, and unless she made peace with God, no clove, powder, or poultice would ease her jaw. She eventually broke down sobbing at the village altar. Whether her toothache subsided, no one recorded. But her confession was loud enough to echo through the square. There were other methods too, not just prayers, but acts of atonement. People fasted when their mouths hurt, not to ease the pain, but to suffer with it. They would avoid speech, shun mirrors, sleep on stone floors, or offer silent acts of service, hoping to show humility, atonement through aching gums. Some even wore iron collars or mouth guards, devices that made speech difficult or impossible. The idea was to muzzle the sinful tongue, to remind the wearer that words had weight and pain had purpose. In more extreme cases, mystics saw oral suffering as a blessing. Visions of saints with bleeding mouths, divine voices humming through cracked teeth, pain that became euphoria. These weren't ordinary toothaches. They were spiritual experiences. A nun in Florence described feeling the hand of the Lord pulling each tooth with care, and claimed to have transcended her body during a particularly brutal molar extraction. Pain became prayer, and in a world where science offered no certainty, prayer was medicine, but not everyone saw it that way. In some villages, especially in Northern Europe, pain was seen as a curse, but not always a divine one. Sometimes it came from jealous neighbors or witches, or even jilted lovers. Toothache as punishment for emotional sins. You broke a heart? Enjoy that infected incisor. You slandered someone at market? Prepare for a week of swelling and sleeplessness. To defend themselves, people turned to apotropaic rituals, the opposite of atonement. These weren't humble prayers. They were protections, charms, herbs, whispered incantations. You'd wear a jawbone amulet carved with sacred letters, hang a tiny iron key above your pillow, bury a pig's tooth under the threshold of your house. If pain came from spiritual imbalance, these objects restored it. If pain came from someone else's malice, they repelled it. Still, the deeper belief held fast. Your mouth spoke truth, or didn't. And it paid the price either way. Even silence was suspect. A mouth closed too long, never confessing, never praising, never singing. That, too, invited divine attention. Because inaction, in medieval thinking, was just another form of sin, a passive one. And sometimes, those were the most dangerous of all. So the mouth became sacred, feared, honored, punished. Teeth weren't just bones, they were moral battlegrounds. And it's a strange thing, isn't it? How something so small, so seemingly ordinary, could carry such weight. A tooth didn't just help you chew, it told the story of your soul. As you fall deeper into your dreams tonight, with your clean, modern molars, your minty toothpaste, and your lack of moral panic about biting into a caramel apple, spare a thought for those who once believed their mouths were barometers of sin, who whispered apologies to saints between clenched jaws, who prayed for pain when none came, because the silence felt like judgment, who lay in candlelit rooms, their mouths open not just in agony but in penance, because for them, pain was more than punishment. It was a path, and the way out wasn't always a cure. You've seen the saints, the sinners, and the blacksmith dentists with their jaw-shattering tools. But before you nod off into a blissful, toothache-free sleep, we need to open one last crooked door in the great haunted house of medieval dental lore, the strange and shadowy world of tooth talismans, charms, and superstition, because long before fluoride and floss, people believed that a well-placed charm could guard your mouth from all manner of agony. Not just protection from pain, but from the curse of rot, the bite of spirits, and the wrath of jealous neighbors with too much time and too many herbs. Let's start with the tooth amulet, a tiny object worn around the neck, tucked under the tongue, or hidden beneath a child's pillow. These were sometimes shaped like tiny molars, carved out of ivory or bone. In wealthier circles, they were made of gold or jet stone. But in the countryside, a simple pebble or dried animal tooth did the trick. People believed that certain stones had oral powers. Amber was said to draw sickness down from the gums. Jet protected against curses, and chalcedony, milky, soft-looking, was worn by midwives to protect newborns from teething fevers. If you had a toothache, you tied the stone to your jaw with red wool and waited for the spirits to change their minds. Color mattered too. Red was thought to scare off infection. Blood scares blood, they said. White protected purity and childhood. Green kept worms at bay. And black? Well, if your charm was black, it was meant to trap evil, absorb it before it could chew through your enamel. Children's teeth were especially sacred. When a child lost a baby tooth, it wasn't just a milestone. It was a magical event. Some parents buried the tooth in the earth, believing it would protect the child's adult teeth from ever falling out. Others threw it into a fire to burn away any lingering pain. In Scandinavia, you'd sometimes toss it onto the roof, asking the birds to carry it to the sun. You've probably noticed this sounds familiar. It's the ancient ancestor of the tooth fairy, but much weirder and with more fire. Instead of a fluttering winged sprite leaving coins, it was spirits, ancestors or local gods, collecting teeth as offerings. Protection didn't come in the form of money. It came in the form of silence, no pain, no swelling, no dental demons. In medieval England, one common charm involved tying a fallen tooth into a cloth pouch, along with rosemary, and 3 drops of the child's blood. This pouch would be buried under a church bell tower. Why a bell tower? Because the sound of the bells would shake the spirits from the roots and prevent future toothaches. Ingenious, loud, possibly very annoying for the local clergy. Then there were ritual incantations. These were whispered, written, or carved into wood or bone. You might scratch a prayer into the handle of your toothbrush stick, or sew a Latin verse into the hem of your shirt. One popular inscription read, "As the serpent was driven from Eden, so may the ache be driven from this mouth." There's poetry in that, whether or not it helped your gums. Some talismans weren't carried, but hung in doorways or above beds. A dried wolf's tooth, a rabbit's foot, or a string of chicken bones might dangle beside your pillow, not to scare you, but to scare away whatever invisible force caused that jaw-tightening, temple-throbbing nightmare called a toothache. In Germany, charms called Zahnsegen, tooth blessings, were written in rhyme, rolled into scrolls, and placed under pillows. In Italy, there were denti d'oro, golden charms given to children to prevent future dental pain. And in Russia, people told stories of Baba Yaga, the forest witch who could steal your teeth if you lied too much. It was part warning, part bedtime story, part early dental ethics lesson. You see, in a world without certainty, superstition filled the gaps. Didn't know what caused pain? Invent a culprit. Didn't know how to cure it? Create a ritual? At least then you had some control, or the illusion of it. And sometimes illusion is enough to get you through the night. One particularly strange ritual, found in parts of Wales, involved chewing a piece of bark carved with your own name, then spitting it into a river at dawn. The belief was that as the bark floated away, your pain would drift with it. If it sank, you were in for another week of throbbing. Supernatural diagnostics, courtesy of the local stream. In the Alps, shepherds would sing to their sheep with aching mouths, believing that harmonizing with the herd could realign their jaw pain. If the sheep bleated in return, it was a good omen. If they stayed silent, time to fetch the local herbalist. There were even stories of tooth familiars, little spirits believed to guard your teeth if treated well. You'd feed them milk, whisper secrets to them at night, and in return, they'd keep the pain away. If you ignored them, you guessed it, rage and rot. And no, not all these beliefs were harmless. Some involved tooth theft, where people would dig up graveyards and steal the teeth of the dead, believing that a strong jawbone from a soldier could imbue the wearer with resistance to dental pain. Others believed in cursing their enemies' teeth, writing their names on clay figurines and snapping the jaws off in secret rituals. Historians still argue about the intent behind these practices. Were they believed literally, or were they symbolic, cultural ways of expressing fear and regaining agency? One thing's for sure, even now, we hang on to ritual. We still keep baby teeth, still leave them under pillows, still tell children stories of a mystical being who wants their teeth. We just made her cuter, so as you relax tonight, jaw soft, breath warm, think of all the tiny objects once hidden in pouches, sewn into tunics, buried beneath roots or tucked into stone walls, each one a whispered hope, a protective spell, a desperate offering to the unknown. Because pain was a mystery, and so were teeth. And in the in-between spaces, where medicine faltered and prayer wasn't quite enough, humans made charms. Maybe you have one of your own, without even realizing it. A lucky necklace, a pebble you carry, a song you hum when anxious. Maybe it's not about superstition. Maybe it's just about feeling safe. You've chewed your way through the charms, cringed at the chisels, and sidestepped the superstition. But before we finally ease into modernity, there's one more hallway to wander down in this shadowy, half-forgotten mansion of medieval dentistry. It's not where the tools were kept or where the prayers were whispered. It's where the stories lived. Because every culture, every village, every dusty back alley and candlelit chapel had its own legends, their own bedtime warnings, half-truths, and wild tales whispered over stew or muttered through clenched jaws. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of medieval dental legends and oral myths. Tales so strange, so specific, and so delightfully deranged that they almost make you forget how painful a rotting tooth really was. Let's begin with the infamous tale of the cursed molar of Kent. According to 14th century English folklore, a nobleman once discovered a particularly large, unusually black molar buried in the roots of an old yew tree on his estate. Fascinated and possibly a bit drunk, he had it mounted on a chain and wore it around his neck as a charm. Within days, he reportedly developed a pain so intense that he lost consciousness during dinner and screamed in Latin when he came to. He brought in physicians, monks, even a traveling French mystic, but the pain only worsened. Eventually, the molar itself cracked in half, with no explanation, and the nobleman's pain vanished instantly. He swore the tooth had been haunted. His estate later banned anyone from planting yew trees. The remains of the molar were supposedly thrown into the sea during high tide, so the devil could retrieve what was his. True? Probably not. Entertaining? Absolutely. Then there's the story of the tooth-eating ghost of Bruges. This tale tells of a young apprentice who died during a tooth-pulling demonstration gone wrong. The audience had gathered, as usual, for a bit of open-air medical theater, but when the barber lost his grip on the forceps, they slipped deep into the boy's mouth. The boy choked, and the crowd panicked. Some say the ghost now roams the alleyways of Bruges, seeking out those with toothaches and offering to finish the job. Locals reported hearing whispers in the night. Just one more tug. Children were warned not to fake toothaches, lest the ghost visit them in the dark with rusted pliers and a too-wide grin. More fanciful still is the tale of the singing tooth from northern Italy. This legend tells of a wandering musician who claimed one of his teeth could sing. No one believed him until one night he fell asleep under a fig tree and began to hum in harmony with himself. The sound came from his mouth, clear, delicate, and strange. A curious monk took him in and examined the tooth. Supposedly, it had a silver thread running through it. The monk removed the tooth and hung it in the abbey's chapel, where it continued to emit faint musical tones during Mass. Some said it was divine, others said it was demonic. Eventually it was stolen, and hasn't been seen since. Was it real? Probably just a cracked filling echoing breath. But back then, that was enough to call it a miracle, or a curse. Let's not forget the exploding jaw of Bremen. This story circulated through the Baltic region in the late 15th century. A merchant, obsessed with hiding his toothache to maintain his social status, kept packing the cavity with beeswax and crushed mint. He refused treatment for years, until one day, during a particularly tense negotiation, he bit into a cold apple and his jawbone shattered, with a sound so loud that the entire banquet hall reportedly fell silent. Witnesses claimed they saw a small puff of smoke rise from his mouth. A bit theatrical? Certainly, but it became a cautionary tale. Never let vanity stop you from dealing with your teeth, or else kaboom. And then there's the more tender legend of the stone-toothed girl of Aragon. According to Spanish folklore, a girl was born with a row of tiny stone teeth, smooth, pale pebbles, not enamel. Her parents were terrified and tried to file them down, but the girl never cried. As she grew, she began placing other children's lost teeth into her mouth during playtime. Eventually, she stopped speaking entirely and only communicated by tapping her stone teeth together, forming patterns. When she died, peacefully in her sleep, it was said the stones in her mouth had softened into pearls. Her village believed she was a spirit meant to ease others' pain by holding it for them. Sweet, strange, both. Sometimes these stories weren't warnings at all. They were coping mechanisms. A way for people to make sense of pain that felt random and cruel. If your jaw ached for weeks with no end in sight, why wouldn't you start to believe there was a ghost, a curse, or a singing tooth involved? At least it meant someone or something was in charge. Folklore is often just medicine for the imagination. One particularly eerie belief came from the Scottish Highlands, where it was said that if you bit into your own reflection in water, your teeth would never rot. People would gather at streams on solstice nights and gently place their mouths against the rippling surface. It didn't do much, other than probably get a few noses wet, but it gave people a ritual, a moment of hope. Another myth, this one from the Balkans, told of a hidden mountain herb that could regrow teeth. Only the pure of heart could find it. Many supposedly went searching, but no one returned with the herb, or with new teeth. Still, the legend kept people wandering the hills, whispering old songs, chewing bitter roots, trying to make magic real, and every culture had their version of the evil dentist. The man with no name, no eyes, or no shadow, depending on the tale, who traveled from town to town, offering free extractions, but taking something else in return: your memory, your voice, your dreams. Parents told these stories to their children, half laughing, half worried. Brush your teeth, they'd say, or the no-shadow man will come and take one while you sleep. You've probably guessed by now, there's something oddly beautiful about all of this. These stories weren't just meant to scare, they were meant to anchor, to give shape to the shapeless. Pain is lonely, it isolates, but when wrapped in story, it becomes shared, understood, held together by the comfort that someone else, somewhere, once felt the same throb in the jaw and thought, this can't be just pain, this must be something more. So tonight, if your dreams carry you into winding forest paths, misty alleys, or abbeys filled with softly humming teeth, don't be afraid. They're not warnings, they're echoes, the old stories, breathing gently through time. And if you wake in the morning and feel a twinge, don't panic. Just remember, it's probably not a cursed molar. Probably. The smoke has cleared, the legends have quieted, and all that's left now is the long, slow exhale of time itself. You've trudged through back alleys of plague-ridden towns, survived the hiss of ancient toothworms, and stared into the flickering candlelight of crude dental chambers, where tools looked more like weapons, and every extraction was an act of faith or fear. But somehow you're still here, your teeth are still in place, and now, finally, we reach the part of this long, bizarre bedtime journey where we trade steel for silicone, wood for porcelain, and prayers for checkups. This is the slow rise from chaos to comfort, the path from chisels to fluoride. Let's glide gently, almost like a dream, into the transition from medieval madness to modern care. Because while the shift didn't happen overnight, it did happen, and it changed everything. We begin in the 1700s, where things finally started to look, ever so slightly, like medicine. Tools became more refined, still scary, sure, but more specialized. Books were written, procedures standardized. Dentistry began to peel away from barbering and butchery. It began to stand on its own. One pivotal figure? Pierre Fauchard, a French surgeon widely regarded as the father of modern dentistry. In 1728, he published Le Chirurgien Dentiste, a comprehensive guide that broke away from superstition and leaned, finally, into science. He covered techniques, tools, hygiene, even orthodontics. He argued that sugar caused decay, that teeth could be cleaned, that cavities could be filled. Fauchard swapped forceps for finesse, and in doing so, he sparked a transformation. By the 1800s, dental schools were appearing. The first dental college opened in Baltimore in 1840. Anesthesia was introduced. Finally, people could undergo procedures without passing out from pain or screaming into the rafters. Ether and nitrous oxide, laughing gas, revolutionized oral care. Suddenly, the experience became survivable and, dare we say, civil. Tools evolved. The tooth key faded into obscurity, replaced by precision forceps. Fillings were made from mercury amalgams, not ideal, but better than burning soot. Dental drills were no longer hand-crank nightmares, but powered devices that actually removed decay without removing half your sanity. And then came the toothbrush revolution. In medieval times, oral hygiene was limited to chewing sticks, rinsing with vinegar, or gnawing herbs. But by the late 1800s, mass-produced toothbrushes with bristles, and eventually nylon, began appearing in homes. Toothpaste followed. Not powdered charcoal or crushed coral, but smooth, minty paste that actually cleaned teeth without causing abrasions. Imagine that. As the 20th century dawned, fluoride emerged as dentistry's new superstar. Discovered to prevent cavities, it was added to water supplies, toothpaste, and mouth rinses. For the first time, children were growing up with fewer cavities than their parents, and keeping their teeth well into old age. That was new. That was big. And perhaps the most radical change of all, pain became optional. Where once people braced themselves for agony, singing monks, toad fetishes, molten iron, now they had reclining chairs, topical numbing gels, noise-canceling headphones. Dentistry stopped being an ordeal and started becoming a routine. The language shifted too, from fear to prevention, from extraction to preservation. Dentists became healers, not last resorts. You didn't have to wait for an abscess to make your face swell before seeking help. You could go for a cleaning, for a consultation, just to talk. Imagine trying to explain that to a 13th century peasant. You'll visit a doctor who just works on teeth. The room will be clean, the tools will be tiny, the pain minimal. They'll take pictures inside your mouth with invisible rays. If there's a problem, they'll fix it with light-cured resin. And afterward, you'll go home and eat soup. Not scream, not faint, just soup. They'd think you were describing magic, and maybe it is. The quiet kind, the soft whir of a drill, the sterile scent of mint and latex, the brief sting of anesthesia before total numbness sets in. In a world that once embraced smoke, superstition, and blunt trauma, modern dentistry is magic. Clean, clinical, life-changing magic. And yet, something of the old world lingers. You still grip the armrests. You still hold your breath when the drill hums. You still feel a twinge of ancient fear when the light tilts above you and the dentist leans in with gloved hands. Not because you expect pain, but because somewhere, deep down, your ancestors did. And those echoes take time to fade, but they are fading, and in their place, comfort, cleanings, checkups, preventative care. You no longer need to whisper to saints for mercy. You don't have to tie charms around your jaw or rub garlic on your pillow. You can floss, rinse, smile. You've made it out of the dungeon. You're here, and your teeth, they're still yours. So close your eyes now. The fire has died down. The hammer rests unused. The saints are silent. And the only sound left is your breath, even and untroubled, as the story draws to a close. But first, the worst is behind you. The pain, the clamor, the desperate prayers to saints you'd never met. Gone now, like smoke drifting from a burnt-out candle. All that remains is calm. You're safe in this moment. The tools have been set aside. The room is quiet. Even the ghosts of old toothaches have retreated. The fear that once clung to you like fog is dissolving, slow and soft, into nothing. Your jaw is loose. Your teeth feel distant, unimportant. No twinges, no pressure, just warmth, gently resting behind your lips, like tiny bones wrapped in velvet. The world of bloodletting barbers and chanting monks is far behind you now. Their voices are whispers in a dream. Their stories, odd, tangled, beautiful, have carried you through the long night, but they don't follow you into sleep. Not tonight. Tonight, you lie under stars that don't judge, in a bed that doesn't smell of smoke or vinegar. You're held, not restrained. Still, not braced. Breathing, not bargaining. This is rest. Let your shoulders sink. Let the last of the tension melt down your spine and into the mattress. You're not in a cold stone room. You're not watching shadows creep across plaster. You're not counting prayers between strikes of iron. You're here. You're whole. You are unbelievably okay. The madness of history has passed through you, and now it drifts beyond you, softened by time and distance. It came with hammers and worms, with blood and bones and poetry, but it leaves with silence, and silence is kind. So sleep now, little storyteller. The past is done pulling teeth. You've earned your dreams, and if you wake with a twinge, just call your dentist. They'll take it from here.